Perhaps the most ingenious new argument developed for Markan priority is the argument from editorial fatigue, spearheaded by Mark Goodacre. Goodacre defines editorial fatigue as follows. Editorial fatigue is a phenomenon that will inevitably occur when a writer is heavily dependent on another's work. In telling the same story as his predecessor, a writer makes changes in the early stages which he is unable to sustain throughout. Like continuity errors in film and television, examples of fatigue will be unconscious mistakes, small errors of detail, which naturally arise in the course of constructing a narrative. They are interesting because they can betray an author's hand, most particularly in revealing to us the identity of his sources. So the idea is that Matthew and Luke possess continuity errors within themselves. These continuity errors, it is argued, are explained by Matthew and Luke making deliberate changes to details in Mark early on in their versions of the same story, and then forgetting that they did this. Thus, they end up copying the original details into their version of the story later on, and thereby create some level of inconsistency or confusion in the final story. Goodacre gives the example of the cleansing of the leper. In Mark, Jesus tells the leper, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest." In Matthew's version of the story, prior to the healing of the leper, Matthew adds the fact that crowds were following Jesus. When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. Yet, after healing the leper, Matthew follows Mark's wording by having Jesus say to the leper that he has just healed, "See that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest." From this, Goodacre argues, in Matthew's version of the story, there are two elements that are difficult to reconcile. Many crowds at the beginning of the narrative, and the charge, "See that you say nothing to anyone" at the end of it. A miracle that has been witnessed by many is apparently to be kept secret. This is in contrast to Mark, where there are no crowds. The Markan leper meets Jesus privately, and the command of silence is coherent. This odd state of affairs can be explained by the theory of Markan priority, for which it is therefore evidence. The first major problem with this argument is that it is debatable that the alleged examples of inconsistencies cited by Goodacre in order to motivate the argument are actually inconsistencies at all. In this particular example, we may begin by observing that Goodacre's conclusion rests completely upon the disputed idea that Matthew 8:1 constitutes the beginning of the story of Jesus cleansing the leper, as opposed to the end of the story of the Sermon on the Mount. If Matthew 8:1 is simply the end of the story from chapter 7, then there is clearly no inconsistency between Matthew 8:1 and 8:4, and consequently Goodacre's argument cannot even get off the ground. As David Neville argues, on the basis of this observation, one might infer that Matthew's version of the story is secondary because he incorporated source material, namely the command to secrecy, that did not fit neatly into his narrative framework. However, as noted above, this judgment depends on whether one reads Matthew 8:1 as Matthew's introduction to this pericope or as part of his conclusion to the Sermon on the Mount. But let us suppose that Goodacre is correct about Matthew 8:1 and 8:4 being part of the same pericope. Is there any reason to suppose that there is a genuine continuity error in this text? The first thing to note is that Mark's failure to mention a crowd in no way supports Goodacre's claim that the leper met Jesus privately in Mark's Gospel. So there doesn't have to be any disagreement between Mark and Matthew in that regard. And what of the supposed inconsistency? Goodacre's argument wholly rests on there being a genuine difficulty believing that a crowd was present when Jesus told the leper to tell no one that he had been healed. But a little reflection will show that there is not any difficulty here at all. In Mark 7:32-37, there is a similar story where Jesus heals a deaf and mute man in front of a multitude and tells the entire multitude not to tell anyone what he has done. Is it so difficult to imagine that something similar happened in Matthew 8? Couldn't Jesus have likewise told the crowds not to tell anyone what had happened? Clearly, according to Mark 7, Jesus himself had no problem with healing in front of crowds and then asking the entire crowd to keep the healing a secret. So unless Goodacre wants to maintain that Mark 7 is also inconsistent, then he must abandon Matthew 8 as being genuinely inconsistent, and therefore he must reject it as being a genuine example of editorial fatigue. Goodacre is also fond of the story of John the Baptist's beheading. The story in Mark is that Herodias wants to kill John because she has a grudge against him, but she could not because Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, she was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. In Matthew's version of the story, this element has dropped out. Now it is Herod and not Herodias who wants him killed. When Mark then speaks of Herod's grief at the request for John's head, it is coherent and understandable. Herodias demanded something that Herod did not want. But when Matthew, in parallel, speaks of the king's grief, it makes no sense at all. Matthew had told us, after all, that Herod wanted to put him to death. The obvious explanation for the inconsistencies of Matthew's account is that he is working from a source. He has made changes in the early stages, which he fails to sustain throughout, thus betraying his knowledge of Mark. This is particularly plausible when one notes that Matthew's account is considerably shorter than Mark's. Matthew has overlooked important details in the act of abbreviating. But again, there does not have to be a contradiction between Matthew and Mark here. Although Matthew does not mention Herodias in his version of the story, nothing he says precludes her from having moved Herod to kill John the Baptist. And regarding Matthew's supposed inconsistency, there is simply no contradiction between saying that Herod wanted to kill John and that he was also sorry to do so. This is simply the well-known distinction between an antecedent and a consequent desire. An antecedent desire is that which considers a thing in and of itself, detached from its particular circumstances or consequences. A consequent desire is that which considers a thing as well as its circumstances and consequences. A familiar example of this distinction comes from the everyday experience of rising in the morning and both wanting to go to work as well as not wanting to go to work. Antecedently, we do not want to go to work because we have other things that we would rather be doing. However, as a result of considering the consequences of not going to work, we consequently do want to go to work. With this distinction in mind, it seems clear to me that this is what Matthew means when he describes Herod as both wanting to kill John and is sad that he had to do it. I believe that Goodacre incorrectly identifies Mark's reference to Herod enjoying John's preaching as being the reason why Herod was sad when the time came to kill John. In fact, the reason Mark gives for Herod's reluctance is fear of knowing that John was a righteous and holy man. This is fully harmonious with Matthew's account, which states that Herod was afraid to kill John because he knew that the people regarded him as a prophet. Both accounts present a consistent story. Herod arrested John at the instigation of Herodias. He antecedently wanted to execute John for speaking out against him despite enjoying his preaching, yet he was consequently afraid to do so because he feared the people who regarded John as a prophet due to his upstanding character. I see no need to suggest that Matthew is changing things within Mark. Rather, I see both stories as being consistent, but with Mark providing some additional details which give us a fuller picture of what was going on. Another supposed example of editorial fatigue is found in the story of Jesus calming the storm. While Goodacre does not use this example, his colleague Joel Marcus does, saying, "Matthew likes earthquakes. He takes over Mark's story about the stilling of the storm, but changes Mark's sudden tempest into an earthquake in the sea. While meteorologically possible, the description here is in some tension with the rest of the narrative, which just speaks of Jesus rebuking the winds and of the disciples exclaiming about the effect of this rebuke on the winds and the sea, not the earth." So Marcus's contention is that Matthew is inconsistent with himself by saying that an earthquake arose in the sea, causing the water to become turbulent, but later saying that Jesus restores peace by rebuking the wind. This inconsistency can be easily explained if we suppose that Matthew has switched out Mark's description of a windstorm for an earthquake, forgotten that he has done this by the end of the story, and consequently ends up contradicting himself. Truly, this is a conflict of Marcus's own making. In saying that the turbulence was caused by an earthquake, Matthew does not thereby deny that winds were also present. There is no tension, let alone a contradiction, entailed by saying that the turbulence was caused both by an earthquake and also by the wind. These events are mutually compatible with one another. Consequently, there is no incoherence within Matthew's narrative, and therefore no reason to suppose that this is another example of editorial fatigue. As David Neville observes, what early reader or hearer of Matthew's version of this episode would not have associated strong winds with a quake in the sea and a boat being hidden by waves? If, as suggested above, Matthew was aware of the parallels between this pericope and Jonah 1, there is no need to posit overzealous abbreviation of Mark's account to explain Matthew's failure to mention the wind in Matthew 8:24. As a result, little source critical weight can be attached to this alleged inconsistency. While I have only offered a detailed analysis of two of Goodacre's examples and a third popular example, similar harmonizations are available for other alleged examples of editorial fatigue. The point is simply that the argument is unmotivated for those who don't accept that there are necessarily examples of inconsistencies within and among the Synoptic Gospels. Minimally, Goodacre and his followers have not provided any reason to think that this hypothesis is more likely correct than the harmonizations which I have proposed. The second major problem with the argument from editorial fatigue is that it assumes that the Gospel authors felt free to deliberately alter the facts. But this is an assumption which is questionable and runs contrary to a prima facie reading of the Gospels, which present themselves as honest historical reportage. There is not sufficient evidence to justify the claim that the Gospel authors felt free to deliberately alter the facts. As Lydia McGrew states at the end of her lengthy study of this topic, there is simply no good evidence that suggests that the evangelists thought of themselves as licensed to invent, and there is a wealth of evidence to the contrary. This evidence, too, will remain to be accounted for, even if some new specific fictionalization theory arises. We need not and should not qualify and confuse this message by saying that the authors sometimes considered themselves licensed to change the facts. The third problem is that even if we accept, for the sake of argument, that the Gospel authors were making deliberate changes to facts and creating inconsistencies, the phenomenon of inconsistencies can be interpreted the other way around. In other words, instead of viewing Matthew and Luke as creating inconsistencies by forgetting the changes which they made to Mark, one could just as easily interpret Mark as fixing inconsistencies within Matthew and Luke. This means that the phenomenon of inconsistencies cannot tell us anything about the order in which the Gospels were composed. At best, it shows that Mark is the middle term between Matthew and Luke in some way. Remember, editorial fatigue is an interpretation of the supposed phenomenon we are considering. The phenomenon itself is just alleged incongruity within the Synoptics, but there is more than one way to interpret this kind of incongruity. Goodacre needs to show that his interpretation of the phenomenon of incongruity is more likely correct than any other. In passing, it's worth pointing out that there is a certain unfalsifiability to Goodacre's arguments for Markan priority. As Powers somewhat humorously observes, Goodacre compares Mark's harder readings with Matthew and Luke, since the way they smooth his roughness and correct his errors supposedly indicates that they were subsequent to Mark. Thus, when Matthew and/or Luke has something that apparently makes better sense than Mark's version, this points to Markan priority. Also, Goodacre claims that both Matthew and Luke suffer quite a bit from editorial fatigue and forget where they are and when they are copying from Mark. Goodacre believes that these elements indicate that Matthew and Luke were working from a source, that is, Mark. Thus, when Mark's material makes better sense than Matthew's and/or Luke's, this also points to Markan priority. So whichever way the situation goes, the explanation is Markan priority. For those attempting to prove Markan priority and disprove Markan posteriority, such evidence is always on their side. Heads I win, tails you lose.